Look, we gon' figure it out. Tell my people we gon' figure it out. Tell my people we gon' figure it out. Tell my people we gon' figure it out. We gon' figure it out. Tell my people we gon' figure it out. Tell my people we gon' figure it out. Tell my people we gon' figure it out. We gon' figure it out. Figure it out. Figure it out.
Okay, my name is Tariq Tofa. I'm from the University of Pretoria. So I'm going to be talking about finding and reinventing an architecture over 3 scales. And I call these scales of humanity and responsibility. The first is where architecture meets the world, the largest scale, where architecture meets the country, South Africa, and where architecture meets us here, between ourselves. 3 scales of architecture. So, some of us are very young, but even to remind the old ones, in those days, euphoric 1994 days, we had the first definitions we have of what a South African was. The first of those came from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, President Nelson Mandela, and then President Thabo Mbeki. And through then, we signed up to this new vision and a new identity and a new collective. And it's important to retrace and remember these things. So in his first State of the Nation address, his first speech in Parliament to the nation, in 1994, Mandela said, "The time will come when our nation will assert with pride that we are South Africans, one thing, that we are Africans, a larger thing, and that we are citizens of the world, an even larger thing." So he's giving us different kinds of collectivities. And he asks us to transcend our own group experience. He says we have multiple levels of belonging. And we should learn to identify with other groups and to show humanity toward them. And this is the first principles of being a South African and an African. Then in 1996, Thabo Mbeki gives a very famous speech. He first starts talking about the South African landscape as a natural background. And then he starts talking about people who inhabit this space. And the first thing he says is very important. He says, "I owe my being to the Khoi and the San, whose desolate souls haunt the great expanses of the beautiful Cape, who fell victim to the most merciless genocide this native land has ever seen." This is the first thing he says. "Today as a country, we keep an audible silence about these ancestors, fearful to admit the horror of a former deed, seeking to obliterate from our memories a cruel occurrence, which in its remembering should teach us not and never to be inhuman again." He's saying something about humanity, right? But he's also saying something about actively refusing an inhumanity. And he cites a genocide, right? So in South Africa, there was genocide. No one likes to say it because it sounds accusative. But he mentions it because he wants people to take a lesson from it. That's why he wants to remind them, don't do that again, right? So Mbeki, the reminder, is not an accusation, but a reminder to take a lesson, lest we repeat it. This is an active, open, generous, dynamic African belonging. It's not your DNA. It's something you do, right? It's not closed. It's not passive. And it's a refusal of inhumanity. And today, we are living in dark times. Don't kid yourself. And Architecture's Voice cannot be afraid of this. This is part of what we signed up to be a South African. And our Pritzker Prize winner this year, he said, first you need to be a person first and then an architect. You need to first become an architect with humanism before you can practice architecture. That's the world. We have a responsibility to the world. South Africa, where does architecture meet us here? So, we all know the apartheid period formally ended with the first democratic elections, and then we moved into a kind of a transition era. And the quotes I just quoted come out of that era. But I would argue that era formally closed with the fees must fall, roads must fall, nationwide storm in 2015 and 2016. And we can no longer use these words, diversity, multicultural, democrat. We can't use those things as superficially as we've become so accustomed to. They no longer have the critical substance that they used to. So I would argue we're in a distinctly new kind of time. So as architects, we're always in the moment. We want to see visual things, but you also need to be able to zoom out now and then and take your coordinates and see where you are. So where are we? I don't think we really know where we are. I think where we think we are has already passed. And we need to zoom out and be able to reflect on and wind back to those things. And are we really those things? Are we really pursuing those paths? I'm not so sure that we really are anymore. So for me, we should realize and understand that architectural thought and practice in South Africa was integrated with the colonial and apartheid system. It was integrated. And they remain our legacy, and they remain the foundations on which we build everything. Today, therefore, nothing is simply business as usual. Rather, it implies a principled vision of reinventing, remaking, reframing, and that will open up new possibilities of design and theory. And we have failed to understand that the institutional reform, the structure of our profession, is the foundations to the design and the theory and so on. But we focused almost entirely on this and very little attention at all to that. So in the words of the Pritzker Prize winner a few years ago, David Chipperfield, he said, looking forward, where does practice go from where we are now? We have to evolve new ways of practice, looking beyond established professional structures in order to better focus on the common good. We have to shift the ship of practice. But at the same time, we may have to invent a new type of ship. It is critical that as we shift from conventional practices, we must also find ways in which practice itself might be reframed to meet such a critical challenge, to become more instrumental, right? So architecture is not a pure science. It's formed through historical processes. And those processes become our foundations, and we take them for granted. And we need to reconceptualize and reinvent. And the last one, where architecture meets us. So we have the globe, we have the country, and then we have our local environments in between ourselves. Where does architecture meet us? And yeah, I mean, especially how do we deal with where we are with local communities and so on and so forth. Ultimately, humanity is not just theory. It involves real human connections. Therefore, what I would contend is that we really need to develop new kinds of partnerships and new kinds of collaborations in civil society and across communities and across different sectors of society. We already have a community engagement model, but that is not really what I mean. We need to bring in other communities, whether they are migrants, whether they are asylum seekers, and people outside of our groups. And those need to come into the architectural space, come into our universities, our institutional structures. And then we will learn from them, and they will learn from us, and their knowledge will become foundational to what we call architecture. And then the last point I'll make is that when we look at, well, firstly, you shouldn't just look at architects and practitioners and academics. That's not, and certainly you should not be looking at career politicians and multi-party political systems to find your role models. It's really not where you're going to find them. I would argue, it seems to me, that we have three kinds of role models in South Africa. We have those that resisted apartheid and oppression, so your Robert Sobukwe, your Steve Biko, Oliver Tambo, and so on and so forth, right? Those are like, those are people who had to resist something. And then you have your transition icons, right? especially Mandela, Thabo Mbeki as well. But I would argue that that period has ended. So who are your role models now? I would argue we don't really know. I think we're looking in all the wrong kinds of places. And I think when people are truly have empathy for their neighborhoods, their communities, their people, you will find them not only doing abstract theory and abstract critique, but you'll find them on the ground. So many people forget that Biko, I like what I like, super critical, super intellectual, but in the last years of his life, he devoted his own full time to Black community programs, all over Eastern Cape, KZN, and so on. Because he realized he had to do things on the ground. He had to interact with people. And people forget that he did that. And I think it's just a remarkable South African example, Imtiaz Suleiman and the Gift of the Givers. Every single day, helping some group, somewhere in the country, somewhere on the continent. And what I would argue is that we need both of these things. We need critical theory and critique to be able to diagnose our problems, and then we need critical community-based practice. And these things have to go together, and they're both marginal, right? We're very scared of critical theory, and we don't really take community practice seriously, so it's very superficial, very underdeveloped. I think this is, for me, this is that third model. And so just to end with Biko, in time we shall be in a position to bestow upon South Africa the greatest gift possible or more unique.
Architecture is home, and home is what we make it. A room that feels like we are embraced by our maker, a city that is the reflection of the resplendent, colorful world dreamed by our mothers. This has been Architecture ZA 2025. Thank you so much.